dilemmas, challenges, and impact. A lot of things are happening, as you would have seen in the last 2.5 days, in terms of policy announcements. All this in a certain fashion is linked with climate change. Because for a minute, if you forget that we are just in India, but we treat ourselves as world citizens, global citizens. From the entire globe's point of view, the most important challenge today for the world is climate change. There is a small amount of literature which says, perhaps you may be able to give us a better idea, but there may be 5 to 10% literature which says that all this is big hoax. Nothing is going to happen to the planet. Changes have always been happening in historical times at different things. Change is inevitable, but there's nothing much to worry. That this will be another hoax like the Y2K hoax on the IT sector which occurred when we entered the new millennium, the year 2000. But that kind of literature is very limited. The majority literature, and there is a fair amount of the scientific consensus on the subject, is that global warming is very real. Temperatures are going up, and this has an immense adverse effect on the planet. And since we are all creatures of the planet, we need to respond to this. And this entire coordination is done by under the United Nations Framework for Climate Change. I'm sure that most of the participants here are aware of the first effective step that was taken in the form of a Kyoto Protocol. Kyoto is a town in Japan where a decision was done that something, the controversy is that this is all happening because of, it's a man-made problem. It is not really a nature's problem. Post-industrial revolution, which started with the invention of the steam engine, by and large, the word development has been used to mean industrial development. And there was an industrial revolution. So over the last 300 and odd years, this massive industrial revolution, all of which was based on energy and based on burning of various kinds of fossil fuels, and mining for all these primary fuels commenced at different stages. If you see the history of coal, the history of hydrocarbons, and perhaps by about 1973-74 or so, there was a broad consensus that the villain of the piece is carbon dioxide. For a long time it was thought it is other greenhouse gases. All of you are aware that certain greenhouse gases were identified, and these gases, there was a plan to kind of taper it off so that it is not used, what is used in refrigeration, etc. But by around 1974 or so, the scientific consensus was that carbon dioxide is one of the major villains of the piece, besides the other greenhouse gas emissions. The Kyoto Protocol was the first protocol where certain mandatory targets were accepted by the so-called Annex A countries. That protocol had an annexure, where the Annex A countries were the developed countries, realizing the fact that after all the Industrial Revolution took place there, a lot of it, and the maximum contributor of carbon dioxide are the developed nations. 10 nations, the required number of nations who had to sign this did it. So it became an agreement. Certain countries, the Kyoto Protocol was not ratified under the governance procedures. Like the United States Senate did not ratify this Kyoto Protocol because they were worried that the American way of life, we don't have any alternative, so this is not the right time to agree to it. there were one or two countries which signed it but much later withdrew from it. But as I said, the required number of people who had to sign this in the UN register signed it, and the Kyoto Protocol became effective. Where countries listed in Annex A, India was not one of them. It was mostly developed countries, and they were to bring down from certain base levels identified a certain lower level. It of course then it had a few mechanisms like trading, like CDM, all these things. After that, there have been further discussions. Discussions keep on happening at the ministerial level, and then obviously there are working groups and others at the executive officers and scientific level. And over the last 4 or 5 years, there has not been much progress because there are irreconcilable differences, and a total agreement is not coming out. In between, perhaps one agreement, if I recall from memory, was at Copenhagen, where they agreed, okay, the world temperatures, taking a certain base and a method of calculating it, will not be allowed to go 2 degrees centigrade more than that base level. Out of that 2 degrees, perhaps some 0.7 or 0.8 degrees has already taken place. And certain, particularly NGOs or the civil society groups in the world which are actively pursuing some of these matters, they did a calculation to say that if we look into the existing contracts between coal companies and power generating companies and assume that all that coal is burnt, it will go up by another 0.8 degrees. So which means the room for maneuver to reach 2 degrees is rather very little. It's only some 0.4 or 0.5. These kinds of NGOs have also been trying to influence investors. They call this as a carbon bubble, saying that people who invest, who advance money for things like coal mines, etc., please remember that investment may become worthless in 10 years' time or 20 years' time. So the entire strategy of working on some of these NGOs was, let us educate everybody, particularly the investing company, since no project can come up without investment, saying that your stock prices will go down so much that, so these kinds of activities are still going on. Now there is going to be a conference in Paris, perhaps commencing towards end of November and moving on to December, perhaps a 15-day or something, when many of these are going to be discussed. And obviously the hope of people pursuing these things is that we may be able to reach an agreement in Paris. But in all these backdoor consultations which takes place between countries, I'm sure that some of the officers in the Ministry of Environment and Forests, as far as India is concerned, must be the interlocutors for any of these discussions, including Dr. Ajay Mathur, who will be joining us at 2:30, the present DG of the Bureau of Energy Efficiency. But in these discussions, they decided, let every country give what they can do. The subject, there is a small mistake. It says climate change is in India's intended notionally determined contribution. It's not notionally, it is nationally. Okay, so please make the correction. Climate change in India's intended nationally determined contribution. INDC's expansion is that, not notionally, nationally. So many countries have submitted this. India has also submitted it about 2 weeks ago. So I'll first request Mr. Nitin Chaudhary, who will quickly run through a status on this. I'd like you to...
Good afternoon to all SEALs. Based on some initial symptoms, a team of doctors or doctor will try to ascertain what exactly has gone wrong. Then we have to chart out a plan of action further for that. So if I can say, it has been established that disease exists and there are various whatever the parameters have gone wrong, and now the further course of action is being charted out at world level over there. And this is a global problem. What I would be presenting here, more if I can comparatively say, it's like a pathological report. I'm not trying to take a stand what should be done or what not should be done. I'm just trying to enlighten this group of people to what exactly is being there. Now, to start with this, there are certain inevitable principles. Even if all of you have studied in the school, Newton's laws of motion, and if I can say it, these laws of motion have been the basic foundation of our growth of industry and all that, what three centuries back he gave it. If I can just reiterate that what we say, first law of motion, that body continues the state of rest until acted upon by external force. And third law says that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. We have been all along the evolution of mankind, there have been certainly endeavors to make our life more comfortable, more enjoyable, and convenience to be added on that. And most of the scientists' work, what we witnessed during past 3 centuries, we have founded our progress onto that. But somehow in subtle meaning of these laws, we missed it in our understanding. Which I can say, when we were developing this, all about this thing, as sir has rightly said, that is based on energy focused development has been there. And while achieving the development, another external force was getting created, and it had started disturbing the state of rest of our environment, of the planet, all that. And as per the third law, if I can say, that planet has started giving its reaction to our actions, what we take. Now there is a serious time we take a note of it and start taking the further action onto it. Now if we can see, what do we mean exactly by climate change? It's basically, all of you understand, it's a variation in the pattern of the environment. I will not go through this scientific definitions attempted to be given by Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and United Nations Framework. What is said, whatever the man-made additions are there to this environment, or whatever efforts we did, and what it has created a focus, a change in the temperatures pattern, change in the cloud-related rainfall pattern. That is what we basically are now addressing the climate change, and that is what calls for a necessary action to be done at our level. I will just quickly go through this because this is what we have already witnessed in our life. Earlier it was thought, as Margaret said, that major greenhouse gases, that is carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide are the major thing, but carbon dioxide has been playing the major role into that. If you can just see the pre-industrial period, maybe just 100 years back, the concentration was 278 parts per million. In 2005, it was found out by this IPCC 2000 report, it has gone up to 379. And global temperature also has gone in the century close to 1 degree Celsius. And this may rise, there is a band of estimates that have been made by the different scientific communities. It can range from 1.8% to 4%. But on an average, it is expected to rise by 2100 century by 3 degrees Celsius as per the IPCC estimate. Even if we reduce the greenhouse gas emission, because whatever the gases are already there in the atmosphere, which are causing the heat not to be radiated outside, the major changes are the rise in the sea level, because the increasing temperature, the thermal expansion of the oceans is taking place. The glaciers are melting, and where the ice causing, that also causes the rise in the sea level. Compared to the 20th century, the sea level has rose by 0.17 meter. And if the same phenomena continues, it is expected to rise somewhere between 0.18 to 0.59 meter by the end of 2100. There are other also natural calamities which we have often experienced nowadays. The frequency of experiences also has increased. Cyclones, flood, droughts, precipitation, and that is expected to go with this rise in temperature. Again, just I will go through this fastly because these are the standard what we are experiencing. So, effects of climate change, majorly we can see the global warming, change in the cloud cover, precipitation over the land, then quicker melting of ice caps and glaciers, reduced snow cover, and increase in the seawater temperature. Now, when did the exactly awakening of this take place? In a formal manner, though our scientists were noticing, first time in 1979, the first world climate was taken place at Geneva. And it was firstly formally noted that climate change is an urgent world problem and we need to pay attention to it. And a World Climate Program was set up by World Meteorological Organization and United Nations Environmental Program. This continued further in 1988. Also in Toronto Conference, this issue was once again addressed, and it was recommended to have a comprehensive global framework convention to protect this. Again, the same thing was formally noted in 1988 conference. Then now 1992 Earth Summit, what is basically United Nations Conference on Earth and Environment and Development, which was held in Rio in 1992, referred as the Earth Summit. A formal treaty was made, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which we call as UNFCCC. It was negotiated. It was supposed to basically international action to mitigate the climate change and environment, but nevertheless it was not a legally binding commitment was there. 1995 also, the first meeting of Conference of Parties, which took place in Berlin, they outlined the specific targets of emission which needs to be achieved. And in 1997, what Sagar Gaite said, Kyoto Protocol, it was the third conference which was held in Japan, that where the formal international agreement was made. A major difference was made the developed countries, which were primarily called as Annexion A1 countries. They said that identified it as a problem because of them, so they took on to them certain targets for carbon emission reduction, and there were different mechanisms were there. Nevertheless, because of political reasons, all of the countries did not ratify, US being one of them. Now, just to see quickly what are the features of this. First time it established a legally binding commitment to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases for Annex 1 parties. This includes the all developed countries. This commitment was again based on the Berlin Mandate which took place in 1995. The implementation of this policy, they had, apart from reducing the targets, some mechanisms were developed. This was called joint implementation mechanism, clean development mechanism, and emission trading mechanism. Now under this protocol, this international emission trading means if both few developed countries have their targets of emission reduction, if one country is likely to exceed their target, they can look towards the another developed country which is perfectly working on the target and has some emission which they can do, so that can be internationally traded. There was the joint implementation mechanism. They can implement a environmental friendly project, emission reduction projects in a developed country jointly, and that will also help into meet their emission target requirements. And a clean development mechanism. This mechanism is intended that developed countries can join together and invest in a undertake a project in a underdeveloped countries or developing countries, for which they will get some credits which will help them to offset their mechanism. Yes. Now, this Kyoto Protocol has been there, it is ending on by 2020, and to say that nothing great has been achieved because major part of the developed countries have stayed away from it. As I always said, US did not ratify it, Canada also has been staying away from it, and now again there was a need felt to look beyond 2020. And in Warsaw Conference of Parties, that is, it was decided that we will request all the countries to come with what we will get INDC, intended nationally determined contribution, means what they can contribute towards this emission reduction and to come out with it. This is to be discussed formally in conference which is going to take place very soon in Paris, maybe December or November end, and then it will lead to a legally binding agreement on these countries. Now, so far, 127 submissions have come to the UNFCCC, which reflects about 154 countries. The submissions include the submission by European Union also. It's a single submission, that's why the countries are more than the submission. It covers around 87% of global emissions by 2010 and 88% of the population so far. Now, India also has been already falling, though our emissions are much below the level, what we are supposed to get there. Still, we have voluntarily contributed to this, going by our father of nation, Mahatma Gandhi's statement, that, and it has been given much before the world could awaken for the emission related issues, that Earth has enough resources to meet the people's need, but will never have enough to satisfy the people's greed. So our INDC contributions, whatever we have committed, are focused on this slide. And the major thing, what is the issue here now, what is the political issue? The developed countries have developed their countries, and it has been basically causing the emissions over there. I will not say they have emitted to cause the development, but now when a global cap is kept on all the countries, developing countries also, to forcefully reduce the emission or to go to low carbon economy, it will certainly have effect on their development and their aspirations about development and the lifestyle of their countries. So India has categorically chosen a low carbon emission development, carbon emission pathway, simultaneously achieving the development and challenges what our country is facing. So a balance has been achieved to be attained over here. Now India has given a reduction target by 2030 about 33 to 35% of the 2005 level that will be, and it can be achieved by renewable energy contribution, enhancement in the energy efficiency, development of less carbon intensive and resilient urban vision, promotion of waste to wealth, and smart and sustainable green transport network. Okay, just to go through what we have given. It's to put forward and further propagate the healthy and sustainable way of living based on the tradition and values of conservation and modernization. To adopt climate-friendly and cleaner path. To reduce the emission by 33 to 35% by 2030 from 2005 level. And to achieve about 40% of cumulative electric power installed from non-fossil-based fuels by 2030. And with help of transfer of technology and low-cost international finance, including from the Green Climate Fund. Then to create an additional carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of CO2 through afforestation and by tree cover by 2030. So this will also help in reducing the carbon content in the environment. Then to adopt the better technologies for agriculture, water resources, then mobilize additional funds capacity. Now just to give what are the comparative studies of different countries have given. Like India has given around 30 to 35% of reduction by 2030, and one of the major ways of achieving is by 40% of energy capacity by non-fossil fuels by 2030. Whereas you can see USA has given a commitment of reduction by 26 to 28% of their level in 2005, and that is the major result is by absorbing the 3 tons of billions of CO2 through energy efficiency. European Union has given a 40% reduction target compared to their 1990 level. China has given 60 to 65. It is considered to be too ambitious, and there are doubts whether it is really achievable. And Japan has given only 18%, and it is perceived by as to be highly inadequate. I would like to make this a factual statement. It may sound political, but I don't intend to have political thing on it. The same Japan, because the nuclear energy also is one of the clean energy resources. Whenever it comes to get into contact with that, they have a stringent stand that they will not help India in any of the technology transfer if it is intended to a nuclear thing. We admire their position based on whatever the countries had suffered in 1945 in Hiroshima, Nagasaki and all that. But the same Japan is not coming forward when they want a nuclear-free world and they want to take a strict stand in that. When it comes to carbon-free economy, their commitments, what they are given this intended nationally determined contributions are far, far away from being adequate. So, if I can say, this is kind of a contradictory stand to their own positions. Now, India's approach, it is not that India has been only waiting for this Kyoto Protocol or INDC to go for that. It is a proactive stand, and it is in our culture that to be very economical friendly. There are certain other strategies also being taken beyond that, beyond this 40%. There was a report by Planning Commission before it got reclassified or rechanged into Niti Aayog. The report was titled the final report on of the expert group on low carbon strategies. It was headed by Dr. Kirit Parikh. It published in 2004. This need was identified, and it had been categorically, the report has said that nuclear and hydropower needs to be pursued with greater vigor, even though there are some feasibility constraints. So this report has in subtle manner said that beyond solar energy and wind energy and other renewables what we are talking about, the conventional non-carbon technologies, what are they existing in today in India, there may be financial viability related issues, but that also needs to be pursued. In 2014, what we are talking now, 33 to 40% reduction on non-fossil, they had attempted 1/3 of power generation by 2030 will be fossil fuel, and low carbon inclusive growth. That is the strategy what we have said. Low carbon, obviously less emission, but an inclusive growth, that means including the growth of the poorer citizens of India also. It should not happen only what we said, because there was an observation in the morning made why the Bureau of Energy Efficiency does not stop Star 1, Star 2 and Star 3 branded products to be thing. I appreciate from the energy concern, but at the same time you can see the cost of only 5-star energy equipments can be afforded by only by affluent class in 4 metropolitans or other maybe 10-15 cities. But inclusive growth means a poorest poor person in India also should not be kept away from the development just because from this perspective. That is what the interpretation is. So our government has taken a very pragmatic view on this, that it should be inclusive growth, though it is not the emission reduction target. And again the Planning Commission has specifically stressed the importance of nuclear power in this crucial future low carbon energy mix. And it is not only required from this, but as I also tried to mention when I was asked the question, what percentage of this solar or wind power energy will cause a disturbance in the frequency band? Because slight deviation in the frequency of a grid may lead to collapse and all that. So that also has to be addressed. And there is the intermittency linked with the wind power and solar power. It can't provide a 24/7 or it can have a base load section. So these issues also to be addressed. From that point of view also, nuclear energy will be a great help in that. And the Planning Commission report has said that by 2030 we should have at least 40 gigawatt of electricity. Obviously there are other dimensions of like our Director Finance was mentioning yesterday, financing at a great issue. So now basic issue as far as now coming back to Indian level. When we talk of clean energy funds, obviously being a developed country, the funding mechanism also plays a great role in that. Now just to take a view of the international mechanism, international funding mechanism work partly at two levels. One is a clean development mechanism initiated by Kyoto Protocol, and then second is the Green Climate Fund, which has been again within the framework of UNFCCC it has been established for adaptation, mitigation and climate change. And domestically through our budget a National Clean Energy Fund has been established about 3 to 4 years back. Now the clean energy mechanism, funding mechanism, there is a slightly focus, though it was not an established principle 2, 3, 4 years back. It was called a polluter pays or emitter pays for it. It had some punitive kind of connotation in that. It was also difficult to establish how much exactly the methodology or the cost of doing away the environmental harm that might have been created emitting by CO2, and you ask that person to make. It's always subjective nature. So there is a subtle shift across the globe also and within India also, and that shift that emitter funds the clean energy option. So this is it to be less non-controversial. And another same theme, the National Clean Energy Fund has been established. So this was created in 2010-11 budget using the carbon tax as a clean energy cess. So under this thing, whichever the carbon, whether coal, imported or domestic coal is utilized by any coal power producing station, they have to, earlier it was 50 rupees per ton coal was to be paid as a form of cess, then it was raised to 100 rupees in 14-15. In 15-16 budget it has been increased to 200 rupees per ton of a coal. Now this money goes to a NCF fund, National Clean Energy Fund, and then can be utilized for the other purposes. So just comparison to greenhouse emissions from various sources of electricity. This is from the World Nuclear Association, this study made by them. If you can see the lignite, closely ranges, though there is a variation, we can see close to 1000 CO2 equivalent for 1 gigawatt electricity, tons of CO2. In coal it is close to 800 up to 900, oil it is within 700 m. And if it goes wind, the wind is the least, even it may be close to 20-40, and same is hydroelectric nuclear biomass. So this is it. So this gives a band where our new capacity added should be focused apart from the solar and other winds. The same numbers are given in this instead of graphical, so in the numerical form. In lignite, if you avoid the lignite, we can avoid around 2581 million, 2500 million tons of CO2, considering the electric demand what we have. If you go for coal, the average cycle emission is 888 tons per gigawatt hour. By shifting to other, we can avoid around 2163. Now just going back to CDM again I am not making a political statement, but the same countries, what I am trying to make, though there is a need of reducing the carbon emission and low carbon energy, they will try to thrust upon the convenient technology and then marketably commercial strategy also to put it. So the same countries are avoiding the CDM benefits also to be taken by the nuclear energy sector across the globe. The International Atomic Energy also had attempted it, but it was not agreed upon by various other parties to the listing, like Association of Small Island States and majority of European Union oppose the idea of giving the CDM benefit for nuclear power, though it is a low carbon technology. As a result, that CDM does not get there because it was finally resolved in Marrakesh conference, with 7th conference of the UNFCCC, that the parties included in Annex 1 to be refrained from using the certified emission reduction generated from nuclear facilities. Okay, now just I will quickly come to the final what we expect from CO2. Generally, when we address the issue, what is being found here, what the developed countries have placed so far under different protocols or theorem, whatever they have done is still being viewed as a very medium and inadequate. There has been a concept that these countries will be funding and creating the finances for developing countries and other countries to adopt the low carbon technology, but that has not come far so far. Even the developed countries have created a green climate fund for the purpose of funding the green technology. But when there was an attempt to ban funding of coal or fossil fuel based projects from this fund, that attempt was also not allowed to be go through, and there is no ban. They said that still from Clean Climate Fund there is a provision, a fossil-based generation project can be funded from this. And now finally, if I can close, because I started with Sir Isaac Newton, there is a statement quotation from him: "Truth is ever to be found in simplicity and not in the multiplicity and confusion of the things." The same thing will say the greenhouse gas emission, climate change, temperature, global, it's an issue identified by everybody. The reasons are also no. But again, not being political, if I can say, there has been a statement, different schemes, different protocols are being floated, different jargons are being coined together. Now this Kyoto Protocol effectively could not achieve what intended. Now we are floating another. We means the United States floating another UNFCCC and INDC and all that. Unless we go and have a simplistic mechanism of addressing this issue, I think nothing may just come out just by floating new schemes and different protocols out there. That's what it is.
I'm happy to actually be stepping in for into Dr. Mathur's rather large shoes, so I'm going to be inadequate to the task, but I'm going to try and share a little bit of perspective on the Indian INDC as it pertains to the electricity sector. I'd like to actually spend the first 5 minutes or so just reacting and elaborating on a few of the comments that have come already, in particular the presentation, the main status paper so far. Just three or four points on this. First, I think our chair talked about the science of climate change. And I think at this point, as he said, the overwhelming majority of the scientific opinion is that the science is very sound on the existence of a greenhouse effect, on the fact that this greenhouse effect is already having impacts. Where the uncertainties lie are whether the whole slew of very complicated so-called positive and negative feedbacks, how those will balance out. Because there are many such effects. And that consensus view is increasingly that the feedback effects are such that over time, if we don't bring this problem under control, you might have so-called runaway climate change. So I'll give you an example. If the ice sheets start melting, then the overall reflectivity of the earth will go down because water reflects much less solar radiation than does ice. So much more, if ice turns into water, much more of that absorption will be captured, and therefore that is what is called a positive feedback. Positive not in the sense of good, but positive in the sense of amplifying. So that science is now quite clear. The exact implications of it are what remain a little unclear, and so the approach people talk about is, well, we should think about this as an insurance policy. What is the cost of the insurance, and one should take steps globally. Second, in terms of effects, I think we do have to be good global citizens, but more important, we have to think of our own interests. And the reason I think that this is an important problem for us is that India is probably one of the most vulnerable countries to the effects of climate change. There is likely to be water disruption, greater storm surges, more violent weather events. Some of the recent IPCC literature, and I've been part of the fifth assessment report of the IPCC on the mitigation side, suggests that wheat yields could decrease by as much as 2% per year as a result of climate change. So these are all extremely, these are effects that are not going to wipe away other problems that we have, but they're going to make the other problems much harder to solve. So I think one should think about it not as a different set of problems, but as a potential amplifier of our existing problems. On the coal story, there is some very interesting politics, as has been referred to earlier, around coal. And there is this question about that is now, it is becoming more and more mainstream. So the papers that were referred to are actually in very prestigious journals. A journal called Nature Climate Change, talking about what it would imply if all the fossil fuel that is coal in particular that has been identified were in fact mined, what it would imply for climate change. So there's quite robust science behind this. What is interesting is the politics. I think beyond the NGOs, this has become a mainstream point of view, and it's a context we have to be aware of. Most recently, the governor of the Bank of England basically made a statement calling for all fossil fuel companies that fall under the ambit of his regulatory authority to start reporting their exposure to risk, that there will be regulations that will reduce the value of coal assets. So this is the governor of the Bank of England. So this is not trivial. US and Japan have recently, just in yesterday or today's paper, have come up with an agreement that basically is going to try and limit the extent to which the export-import banks of all the industrialized countries will provide co-financing and guarantees to coal-based mining and coal-based power projects. Now that is not something that is part of this international agreement, because export-import banks are basically instruments of national policy in countries. So all of these things mean that in India, the global context, so whatever we decide to do nationally, we can do. That is our prerogative. But the global context within which we operate is likely to change. And I think that's something that we have to really think about and pay attention to. I completely agree with the statement that India has a great deal of development to do. We need a lot of energy. A lot of it is going to have to be coal energy, and I'll get to that in a minute. But I think we have to think about this as carefully as we can, given the global context. Just one comment on the table of INDCs that our colleague from NPCI put out. I just issue a little bit of a caution in interpreting tables of that sort. That table put down percentage numbers for different countries. Some of those percentage numbers are absolute emission reductions from a baseline. So in the case of the US, it's 26 to 28% below their 2005 emissions by 2030. In India's case, it's 33 to 35%, which is a higher number, but it is a reduction in emissions intensity, which is emissions per unit of GDP. So what that means is industrialized countries typically take a emission reduction that says here is our level in 2005 and we will absolute terms go down. Developing countries say in absolute terms we will go up, but in relative terms, in terms of the unit of carbon or GHGs per unit of GDP, we will go down. So that allows us to go up in absolute terms. So the two are not directly comparable, and I think that's quite important. In fact, the biggest challenge in this whole business is making these things comparable and figuring out whether something is ambitious or not ambitious. So for example, this comment about Japan being not ambitious, it is in fact not ambitious compared to what most people think Japan could do. But it is more ambitious than the US in that their base layer is 1990, whereas the US base year is 2005. That makes it and 2005 happened to be a year of very high emissions right before the financial crisis. So it was strategically chosen. So these things are not so easy to compare back and forth, and including our own story in that. So I just urge a little caution with that. Final point before I make just 2 or 3 slides. In terms of the costs and this idea of the polluter pays principle in particular, again this becomes confusing, and the reason I put all this out is I'm deliberately making the waters a little bit muddy, because one should understand that this is an extremely complex debate. What are the true costs of India taking action on mitigation? Now, in some ways there will definitely be costs. So for example, a huge proportion of our population relies still on biomass for cooking, heating, and so on and so forth. Biomass is basically a fossil fuel free source, because that wood is cut down, it gets regrown, it basically gets recycled in a sense. That has huge implications in terms of indoor air pollution, health of women, time for women collecting wood, and so on and so forth. It is imperative for us to move to modern forms of fuel for cooking. But those modern forms of fuel, whether it be gas, whether it be electricity based, will almost certainly increase greenhouse gas emissions. Does that mean we shouldn't do it? Absolutely not. We absolutely must do it, because for development reasons, we have to do it. But at the same time, there are other gains to doing that. The gains in terms of indoor air pollution reduction for women and drudgery and so on and so forth. Let's take the transport sector. If India shifts to increasingly to public transport, that has greenhouse gas gains for sure. But the reason we would shift to public transport is not greenhouse gases. We would do it because our cities are not livable. We would do it because of local air pollution. Now, here's the tricky bit. If we would do these things anyway, then should we be doing that under our own steam or based on finance and technology from overseas? That is the tricky question. What are we doing for domestic reasons and what are we doing for pure climate reasons? It's very hard to draw a line between those two things. And so you have this discussion, and India has framed our policy ever since the National Action Plan around this idea of co-benefits, that we will do what is in our developmental interest, and many of those things will yield climate co-benefits. Some things that we could do purely for climate reasons will cost additional money, and that the international community must support. But so far we have not tried to draw that line between those two things, and that is a very difficult line to draw. Last point I will just make is on nuclear. we talked about the low carbon committee, and I was involved in that committee report, maybe going to 40 gigawatts. And the INDC gives the number of 63 gigawatts, which is also what the integrated energy policy had given. Now I just make the point that if you go to 40 gigawatts and you expect our grid to go to somewhere between 700 to 900 gigawatts, the IEP said 800 to 1000 gigawatts, then you're basically in the order of 7 to 8% of your total capacity. So nuclear may be necessary, may be a good complement to renewable energy, but I don't think that is the biggest story that we have in front of us, because it is at best a 5, 6, 7, maybe 8% part of our 2030 mix. So I just say that it's worth talking about, but I don't think that is the center of gravity. The big question I think for us is how much renewable energy can we add? There is clearly a political momentum behind it. We have said 175 gigawatts of RE by 2022, aside from the INDC, though it's also in the INDC. How fast can we increase renewable energy, and what are the implications for our electricity sector? I think that is the real question, are we going to grow to a point where it's substantial? Is it going to a point where it's going to displace coal, or is that science fiction? Is that unlikely to happen? I think that is the big question that we have to ask. And that's what I'm going to try and shed some light on in 2 or 3 slides. So we did some analysis, and if you are interested in the details of this, we have a blog post on our website, which is cprindia.org, where all of these are detailed. So it's very hard to figure out what that 40% fossil fuel free target actually means, because it depends on your assumptions about nuclear, about hydro, which are the other 2 big fossil fuel, also biomass, which in this case we set aside, and the total size of the grid. Now, there are some numbers in the INDC which I actually think are a little bit unrealistic. The numbers in the INDC are in terms of generation and translate to a grid size of somewhere between 600 and 700 gigawatts in 2030, which, depending on what you think the total average capacity utilization of the grid is going to be in that year. We think that's a little unrealistic. We use the numbers from 700 to 900 based on a series of other studies, including the IESS that was mentioned in the last panel. Based on our numbers, we would suggest the FFF target translates to a RE capacity addition of 150 to 276 gigawatts. This is using a nuclear number of 17 gigawatts, lower than 40 and lower than 67, based on a reasonable growth rate from where we are now, and using a hydro number of 67 gigawatts based on 3% growth rate from now to 2030. The lower end of that 150 number is based on the high assumption of nuclear, 63 gigawatts of nuclear, whereas the 276 gigawatts is based on the low assumption of nuclear. So this is a very wide range. I think the more credible range is somewhere around 225 to 276. So say 225 to 275. In that range is what renewables will be. At the high end of that, that means renewable capacity addition equal to the total size of the grid today, approximately. So it is a substantial increase, heroic increase. We will probably be the second largest addition after China. China's projections on its INDC say they will add about 600 gigawatts of renewables. That is where they will go. As part of it, I think about 1,000 of total fossil fuel free. Okay, now, but we have this 2022 target. You'll notice that the low end of the range, 150 gigawatts, is in 2030, is in fact less than a 175 gigawatt target in 2022. So something is wrong there, and it has to do with this assumption of nuclear and size of the grid and so on. But if we meet the 2022 target, then we are unlikely to slow down, and we are probably going to actually, this is the graph that I want to show, will actually overcomply. This is just this information in graphics. So this is the 2022 target, this is the 2030. This band here represents the different range, 700 to 900 gigawatts, and with the middle being 800. If we manage to do this, we will probably overcomply and be way up here somewhere. Okay. If we don't do this and we form a more moderate trajectory, then this number looks more feasible. Because I think a number of people think 175 by 2022 is a little heroic. Ironically, if we do this, then we are front loading all our effort. Our CAGR will be higher for this period, the first period, than for the second period. And in the second period, when the costs of RE are likely to be lower, the technology is likely to be more mature, we may have fixed some of the problems we have with adoption of RE. So this trajectory makes little sense. So either we choose this trajectory, or this over-compliance trajectory up here. And we don't know actually which it is. And there needs to be some policy clarity on this point, I would submit, coming out of the IPC. What is this now? This is just capacity, and as many people always say about renewables, capacity and generation are two different stories. So what does it mean in generation terms? Now that's again very hard to figure out. You have to make all kinds of assumptions about capacity, utilization factors and so on. Our estimate is that RE will account for 28 to 31% of grid capacity by 2030. But that translates to only about 13 to 14% of electricity generation. Now these are highly sensitive to your assumptions about overall capacity utilization factor. This number might go up. So we've computed this to provide a lower bound. If the technology gets more mature, if some fossils are used, gas, etc. is used for balancing, then these numbers will go up, maybe as high as 17-18%, but unlikely to go higher than 20%. So a key point that comes up here is the kinds of destabilization and balancing issues are probably not going to manifest at under 20% in any serious way, though there are many people in the room with more expertise on this than me, but that is my sense. That is the experience looking at countries like Germany and so on that have increased RE. Given that we are talking about 13 to 14% of fossil fuel of RE and 28 to 30% of FFF, that means that even with large RE capacity addition, fossil fuel based generation, gas, coal in particular, will have to account for as much as 79% of actual generation. So we're still looking at 80% generation coming from fossil fuels in 2030, which is a very important point given what I said earlier about the growing global context to try and limit the amount of coal. The big joker in the pack here though is the demand side, which we just talked about. What if these numbers are all wrong? What if it's not 700 to 900? What if we radically change our demand patterns? What if we move to a system as has been talked about now only in the realm of science fiction, but just, we have to start speculating about these things. What if we have autonomous vehicles which are already being test driven in many parts of the world? What if those autonomous vehicles tied to an Uber model become a shared mobility story? What if that then gets integrated to the grid? So you have these mobile batteries. We now have a hotline to Mr. Tesla, what is his name, head of Tesla. So maybe is that the kind of very radically different future we have to imagine? Because all these calculations are based on a future very much like the present, and we don't know if that's true. On the demand side, if things change dramatically, and these numbers are more in the 500 to 600 gigawatt range in capacity terms, then renewable energy becomes a much larger share of the total story. Just one final point before I conclude. With all of this heroic RE, the RE share will displace about 5% of India's total greenhouse gas emissions. That's all. Given that this is a lower bound, maybe it's 8%. Not very much. Not very much in relative terms. So domestically what it means is electricity is part of the story, but we have to look at our other sectors. We have to look at transport, we have to look at buildings, etc., etc. A lot of things again on the demand side. But in absolute terms, this 5% is equivalent in greenhouse gases to almost the entire, somewhere between 60 to 70% of South Africa's entire 2030 emissions pledge. So in global terms, it is huge. That is the weird, peculiar dichotomy we find ourselves in. So, concluding thoughts. First, I think the demand side is key. We are spending a lot of time thinking about the supply side. We have to think about the demand side, and we have made much better projections. Even the IESS does not have very good projections for our demand futures. And we have done a review, again on our website, looking at 7 different modeling studies, including the low carbon study, IESS, various NGO studies and things. And the demand story is incredibly divergent across these studies. We don't have a good story about how much energy we are likely to need and where it's going to come from. Second, even if the balancing requirements for RE aren't big by 2030, they will be later than that. So questions of fixing the transmission system, thinking about distributed generation, thinking about net metering, thinking about distributed storage, and about new technologies for battery storage are important. Third thing, whether it's coal, whether it's RE, the elephant in the room, as it has been for the last 15 years, remains DISCOM finances. nobody is going to buy more expensive RE now until that those discom finances are fixed. And I hope there's been a lot of discussion here. I'm sorry I wasn't here. I was in Bangalore yesterday. I would have loved to have joined yesterday's discussion. But that seems to be the continued elephant in the room that has not gone away. As I mentioned, this trajectory of RE depends on the 175 gigawatt target. So with those remarks, thank you very much for the
To
time.
utilize this opportunity, because myself and Mr. Verma, we belong to an older generation. So we have been repeating whatever we know. But we would like a younger generation back to respond to queries that you may have. Because whatever we have covered in the last 2.5 days impacts the organization in which you are working in one way or the other. Besides impacting all of us as individuals, it impacts the organizations in which you are at various levels, and you will have to face these challenges. And so whatever can be predicted, one can start thinking about it right away, and that will be a great help. So I make this session of open house. Questions are welcome. Please introduce yourself and then ask your question. Either talk very loudly or wait for the mic.
He told that by 2030, Triple F pledge, RE share will be 28 to 30% in terms of installed capacity, and in terms of generation, it will be 30 to 40%. In project scenario, with 15% of installed capacity of RE, the generation is only 3%, because capacity utilization factor is less than 20%. So how can this be true? With 30% installed capacity, I hope this will not go beyond 6% in terms of generation. In terms of generation of electricity.
The most difficult things we had with this was making assumptions about capacity factors. We used the calculations we used CRC capacity factors, so 0.19 for solar, and I think 0.25 for wind. I can't remember off the top of my head. It's a good question. I can't answer off the top of my head why the ratio is different, but I suspect it has to do with. I'll have to go back to the notes and see. But these are the capacity factors we used. We didn't make any assumptions about higher capacity factors because, of course, that is we don't know what the future holds. So our deliberate effort was to say we will use current information and we will make an informed judgment that the technology, as the technology matures, those capacity factors are likely to increase, and therefore this is a lower bound. That is the way we had done our argumentation.
But it can
What we didn't factor in was whether or not with better grid management and better transmission networks, you could deal with variation by better interconnections across the country and those kinds of things. So all of those things would lead to higher utilization of renewable energy capacity. We didn't make any of those assumptions. We said that the direction will therefore be upwards. But maybe if you could come to me afterwards, I can look into the details of the calculations. I'm happy to look at that and see how we got.
Yeah, next. Please introduce yourself.
What demand we have projected is 700 to 900. How much it is legitimate? One thing is that you are managing demand side management, so it will be lesser. And if I project my peak demand is 1,50,000 megawatt as of now, and I quadruple it, it will be maximum 6,000. 600 gigawatt. And if I manage demand side management, say achieve 20% efficiency, so I will reduce it by another 120 gigawatt. So at best my demand will be 480 gigawatt. And adding to that 175 gigawatt of solar you will be adding by 2022. You are exposing the economy, say by 2030, 50% of solar will be there and 20% something wind will be there. And then 79% of conventional is also there. So there will be lot of capacity conventional plant that will be stranded. So how to mitigate that?
Then I'll request him to respond to all the questions. Again, introduce yourself.
From the regulator.
Huh?
From the regulator.
Okay.
So this what 800 gigawatts with what we have projected in 2032, what it would be, means what would the demand be or what we need to grow at, is with respect to the 8% growth, and that was projected in 2010, I guess. And after 2010, we have not grown at 8%, at much below that rate also. So the 800 gigawatts projection has also to be revised backward on a backward side with that concept.
This is a very important question. Depending on how these numbers work out, either you will end up with stranded fossil fuels, as you said, or you will end up with a shortage of fossil fuels, as these numbers seem to suggest, or you will have some happy medium in between. Depending on which of these answers you think, you would plan your electricity system very differently. You would invest very differently. If you think that this gentleman's story is right, you will end up with, you will say, okay, all this business about coal, being shut down globally does not matter to us so much, right? To be very honest with you, including the drafters of the INDC, I can say this quite openly because I am a non-governmental person. My job is to be provocative. I am with an independent think tank. I want to move our understanding further along. It all depends, as you said, on the assumptions. But let's unpack the assumptions a little bit. In the INDC, the number they give for they don't give a number for capacity. They give a number for the number of terawatt hours demand, not produced, demand. So then you have to make an assumption about. They say, you brought up GDP. The INDC uses an average GDP of 8.6% growth by 2030. Average. Extremely ambitious in my view. So we ran different scenarios. We said, what if it's 6.5, 7.5, 8.5? Because that's more realistic. The 700 to 900, we didn't go with 600. We started out with 600 actually in our first run of calculations. We didn't go there because it's not just the integrated energy policy which used 8.5% growth. We reviewed 6 different modeling studies, governmental and non-governmental, and their growth, their assumptions, they used growth rate assumptions of between 7 and 8.75% GDP growth rate, which then leads to this range of 700 to 900 gigawatts. Okay. Of course, you then need some measure of the elasticity of GDP with regard to energy, electricity, which is also something that can be. So there's lots of moving parts here. We always want to come up with an envelope. What is clear is that if we were wrong to put 700 gigawatts as the lower end, it's possible. We started with 600. Maybe 600 is a more realistic lower end. I think 900 is probably too high. The IEP, remember, said 1000. But my bottom line is, this is the question we have to ask.
Thoughtful assumptions will have to move forward.
If we are in a 500 to 600 gigawatt world in 2030, then the biggest challenge for us is going to be balancing issues and grid stability. If we are in an 800 to 900 gigawatt world, the biggest challenge for us is pure raw coal power and pushing back against any international restrictions. Two very different challenges, two very different strategic and policy implications.
Related to this question, you have told that you have used 5 to 6 models. So I will request you to elaborate something upon that. Because if I project simply based on GDP, if we are projecting 8.5% GDP growth, and for sustaining that growth, if I take it as 11% of power sector growth, by a thumb rule, demand will be doubled in say 7 years, and it will be quadrupled in coming 15 years. So peak demand, which is standing 1,50,000, that will be quadrupled maximum. So I will be eager to know what other models and how does this correlated.
Sorry, you're using on the basis of peak demand of
150,000
billion units. So,
by the way, that website which Planning Commission and version 2 was released what is it?
IESS.
ISS.
IESS.
Yeah. IESS. I've seen that website. IESS is actually, if you type out IESS on Google search, go into that site. It's a site prepared for the Planning Commission with contributions of a few others. I think this organization called Prayas in Pune was also involved in that exercise. Many others were involved. So that you can use as a model and do your own work also. That is, basically it's something like an Excel sheet format. So various scenarios you can build, and you can also play with it. It's time consuming. I did it a few times, then I got kind of my mind shifted to other things. But people who are deeply interested in this, it's a very good modeling site. The idea is you can put in your own scenarios and then see the results. So my recommendation is you do that. Of course, now I'll let you.
Thank you. It's a very good question, and I also recommend the model is a spreadsheet. So we included the IESS results. They have a range of scenarios. We picked the middle ones. IESS is a spreadsheet model, right, with fixed parameters. When I said 6 or 7 models, these are not our models. These are models by the modeling community out there. So one is a World Bank study, one is TERI, one is CSTEP, which is a Bangalore research organization, and so on and so forth. One is IIM Ahmedabad. These models are of basically 3 types. There is the spreadsheet version, which is not an optimization model. Then you have a bottom-up model, where you're basically building demand scenarios and you're aggregating that upwards, right? And you're doing some optimization within those scenarios. And then you have a top-down model, which is a macroeconomic model, where GDP is endogenous. It's not exogenous, it's not something you assume, but it's something that comes out of the model. And there's a feedback loop between GDP and energy. The problem with those models is the energy sector is not very well defined. And it is based on an input-output matrix that is actually quite old. And in the original input-output matrix, there was not even coefficients for renewable energy. So they don't capture the energy sector, electric sector in particular, very well. That is why you have this wide range. We wanted to see how much these models are in agreement. Again, anybody who emails me, I'd be happy to share the report with you. It's a 30-page report summarizing this. We found that the models, these 7 models, which were the basis of our policy making, project our 2030 emissions as being either double what they are today or triple what they are today. 100% range in 15 years. Not a very good basis for policy making. So there is a lot more analytical work to be done to understand what the future is. And I think the key policy question is this one, I'm going to repeat it again, whether we are in a world of high share of renewables where grid stability is an issue, or a share of low renewables generation where fossil fuel based power is the issue.
Yes. Once again, please introduce yourself. Sure.
My name is Prem Srivastava and I come from Power Finance Corporation. Well, with the backdrop of the discussions which we had today and the past 2 days, in the backdrop of the renewable energy focus and also the climate change, my question to this learned panel would be the relevance of Government of India's program of large capacity additions, which are flagship under the UMPP program, Ultra Mega Power Project, which are predominantly, definitely they are all coal based and thermal in nature. So what would be your take on this?
I think I'll react and then ask my colleagues also to react. Well, to take a story a little behind. At a certain point of time, when the previous government was in power, that is Dr. Manmohan Singh's government, UPA 1 and UPA 2, almost 10-12 years back, there was a report called the India Infrastructure Report, made by a committee headed by Rakesh Mohan, who at one time was Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank. And the main conclusion of the report is that India is in the present stage of development of India. Infrastructure is the other critical bottlenecks. Infrastructure in terms of power, telecommunications, roads, ports. And hence the country should concentrate on how to unshackle these infrastructure bottlenecks. I mean, almost everybody sitting here is aware that many factories have 2 days of load shedding, which they could have produced, but obviously power is also a bottleneck. I think there were situations in Karnataka and Tamil Nadu where 3-4 days of load shedding was there. There was a time when Coimbatore, which is a very, full of a large number of small engineering industries, all of them were idle because there was no power. But power was also one of the critical bottlenecks. If you recall, when the Manmohan Singh government took over 10 years ago, I'm talking of the UPA one itself, the Prime Minister also identified that this infrastructure, he even pleaded with his coalition partners and the UPA chairperson that at least give me the full freedom to pick up the right ministers for the infrastructure sectors. I mean, the Prime Minister really believed in this, and the roadmap for that was what had been given in this report by a committee headed by Rakesh Kumar. Electricity was one of them, power was one of them. A second thing is, if you take the country at the kind of macro level, poverty was identified as the most important pressing problem of the country. And there was always this problem of the vicious cycle of poverty. People, because of the accident of birth, if they are born in a poor family, the chances that they'll be able to improve the position is not very high. Because poor family means poor nutrition, poor health, then you can't go to any school. The schools teach only the local language. You miss out on mathematics and science. So the question of going to engineering colleges does not arise. There are huge dropouts. So India is a country where there's not only poverty, but if you're born in a family which is poor, it becomes self-sustaining. So economists always used to argue this, that can we cut this vicious cycle of poverty? There's a broad consensus, very broad, that if you want to cut the vicious cycle of poverty, you need a sustained 8 to 9% rate of growth of commercial energy. That is electricity, hydrocarbons, etc. Not counting, perhaps bullock power is still the main source of energy in many parts of the country. But commercial energy, and as was mentioned, there is a certain elasticity between GDP and growth of commercial energy. I don't know what the current elasticity is. Perhaps it is 0.9 or so, 0.8 or 0.9, 0.8. So which means if you want a 8% rate of growth of GDP, you need at least about a 10% rate of growth of electricity. So electricity was a very important sector. The idea was how to bring it about. And then came the Kirit Parikh committee report, that is the integrated energy policy. Kirit Parikh at that time was a member energy in the planning commission. And the government of India accepted the report of the Kirit Parikh committee, which again, recalling from memory, said that even around 2032, the projection they had done up to 2032, coal will be the mainstay of electricity production. 75% or something will come from coal. So, government having accepted the Kirit Parikh committee report, the further planning on the electricity sector was based on that. And even now, in a certain sense, even though now I'm not in government, but still the thing is, you can't do away with coal in the near term, or at least even in 2032. And so these various concepts came, one of which was this ultra mega projects, UMPPs. The UMPPs were built. Even today, if you see what government is doing, at least the present government, while on the one hand they will like to propagate renewables, and the most ambitious program is this 175 gigawatt renewables. The present government in India is not ignoring coal. In fact, there have been some decisions which the environmentalists oppose as being rather risky or not good. But government is saying, how can we open more coal mines? There is a debate happening in this country, whether in the development environment debate, even if not stated, there is a tilt to the present government towards development, even if it means at the cost of environment. The number of coal mines planned in areas like Chhattisgarh, which is completely forested. So there are, the literature on the subject, particularly from the NGO side, brings out many of these problems. This recent action of the government against Greenpeace is also perhaps related to Greenpeace is one of the organizations which is proactively opposing coal mines. So every order issued by MOEF gets appealed to the National Green Tribunal, and all these things will at least delay the opening of coal mines, etc. But from what I make out, government realistically is of the view that we'll try to bring down coal. That's why the more recent report which Nitin mentioned can be considered as a 2014 report of Kirit Parikh himself. Then obviously Kirit Parikh would have been told, how can we bring this? That is what he mentioned. So the question which you asked, is there a contradiction? Perhaps not. That is because poverty continues to be the main problem. Economics depends on investment, but politics depends on one man, one vote. So your constituents of people who are going to come to the polling station, that large number can't be ignored by any democratically elected government. That is one of the dilemmas. That is one of the dilemmas in the country. So trade-offs are being made. Anything to add to it, sir?
Just one word. I would say, just in terms of the numbers, if we are in, let's say, the 500 to 600 gigawatt 2030 range, and we do manage to achieve 250, say, of renewables, we still need another 250, 300. Which, and of course, we have, about 250, 270 right now. So, under most scenarios, coal has to go up from where we are now, even if we are in a low gigawatt, 20, 30 gigawatt world. So in that sense, there's not a contradiction yet. The question is, maybe it will become a contradiction in a few years, but at the moment, we definitely will have a shortage, even under very optimistic assumptions about achieving our development with relatively low capacity addition. So I think so we have, at the moment the strategy of doing both coal and renewable makes sense. How soon that starts becoming a contradiction depends on these numbers, but probably not, at least for the next 5-7 years.
Sir, I have a question. Myself, Suresh Kurti.
Just a minute.
By confusions which people have. Number one is the demand projections. Everyone makes their own demand projections. This paper also, various scenarios they have worked out. I would suggest that the demand projections of electricity in the 5 years from years to 20 years from now, so please consult the power survey report of CEA. It has been seen that the power survey done by CEA tallies within plus minus 5%, plus minus 3% in the next 5 years, and plus minus 5% in the next 10 years, something like that. The uncertainty is because there are various factors on that. And as per those projections, I think about 6 lakhs megawatt or between 6 and 7 would be the right kind of projections at that point of time. Now the elasticity of electricity is also coming down, and because as the efficiency increases, the GDP to electricity development. So as per one estimate which we made about 5 years ago, that maybe if the GDP grows by 100, then the electricity growth at 70% will do this job, and therefore our demand has to come down with time. It depends on how do we proceed on the efficiency sector, on the industrial sector, the technology, etc. what we are doing. Number two, it's not possible to reduce the addition of the coal-fired power stations unless the nuclear comes on board. Nuclear and coal will have to stay. 100 minus nuclear would be the coal. always, because while planning, we don't plan to meet the peak demand based on the renewables. It cannot be done. Therefore, renewable is an extra benefit, investment, or whatever you may call it. It is an advantage to save coal, fuel. And therefore, the saying that we would reduce coal is impossible for us. Unless the nuclear picks up, of course, that nuclear plus coal combination. And of course, gas is another thing. If gas is more available, then maybe the carbon dioxide production is less because the gas fire station. That scenario has been there. Only one confusion in my mind I had that when we project our reduction of the CO2, it is not in absolute terms. It is not possible to reduce the CO2 absolute emission because after all our demand is growing day by day. And therefore CO2 has to increase. Perhaps the per unit of generation CO2 reduction can be achieved. We are achieving our CO2 per million units generation is coming down because we are adding supercritical technology and we are also adding, for example, the renewables. In nutshell, on an average basis, the per million units of generation for the production of CO2 has to come down. So this is how we have to go, and we have to be cautious on that. To me also it appears that even if a very faster addition of the solar etc. will be there, but in terms of percentage, the generation would be very little, and therefore is not going to very materially affect us in the very near future. What Germany has faced, we may not face in the near future, but we have to be cautious, and right from this stage, we must take action, build our stations with those capabilities so that we can sustain higher fluctuations. Nitin, you want to say something?
Basically, what we are planning to reduce the carbon emission and all that is increasing the share of renewable energy. Information report I mentioned, it's 30 to 95 to 40%. But I will say it other way. So we still have acknowledged the fact up to 60% will be coming from conventional. And when we add that, we have to look out for the economically efficient ways and other things. That UMPP is one of the instruments for that. So it is not exactly that carbon coal-based plants are totally eliminated out of this.
I think one last question somebody wanted to.
This is Suresh Kodde, but why can't we emphasize on the nuclear energy, or rather why can't we emphasize for augmenting the nuclear energy? Due to the following factors, see, there is no scarcity of fuel. It is a successful and proven technology, nuclear is, and cost of production is also very less, and cost of generation is also comparatively less. And if you see the carbon emission, it is also nil. Nil carbon emission is there. Why can't we augment the nuclear energy? Here we are ignoring that aspect. We are emphasizing renewable energy.
No one is ignoring. These targets are coming from outside. But we are not able to achieve even those targets which are given by.
Fund is the problem. There is a equity funding from the government side also. Simply saying enhance the nuclear reactors is important.
It is not that nuclear target addition has been restricted by the other non-nuclear people in the policy. It's nothing like that. A well-planned study has been made by the policy level. What is the maximum possible addition we can do within the constraints of fuel availability, imported fuel, technology transfer and all that. Within that, targets are set up and those targets are appropriately taken into account by the policy maker. There is nothing like maybe perception is slightly misconceived, that's what I will say. All has been taken into account based on the capacity addition possible within this constraint given by the department is factored into the while making this projection.
Any other question? Yes.
I just want to ask what is the future of the CDM market, because whether this issue will be taken up in the next conference, because it is an important issue as far as the developers are concerned. Because when the CDM market was created, it was a very beneficial market, and the people, after taking into the consideration the money which they will get out from this, they go for the competitive bidding. But eventually what has happened, the market has been crashed and they are into losses. So whether this thing will be also taken in the next conference, and
the CDM market was driven by the Kyoto commitments by Annex A countries. The next round of commitments or pledges now are these INDCs. Many of the countries, I don't know the number off the top of my head, have given their INDCs in terms of what they will achieve within their own borders. Many of them. If that is the way in which the pledge is framed, it basically means that they're not really going to be interested in CDM credits in order to meet their pledges. Those that have said it's open, then of course it's a different story. I don't hear in the policy space a great deal of discussion anymore about CDM. I think that this whole carbon trading business will now depend on the national regulatory frameworks that country after country set up. So if a country decides to meet its pledge through a certain national regulatory framework that allows you to basically bring in carbon credits from overseas, then the CDM market will revive. But in a sense, one now has to wait and see what the national regulatory framework in country after country is going to be, is my sense.
Small observation. More than the specific framework of CDM industry, if you see the genesis for that developed countries taking the onus onto themselves, that okay, we'll fund the clean or low carbon projects in other countries.